Hey, Nimesh, welcome to David Anderson talking market data on air. That's my Christmas present from my wife. Yeah, she's actually invested some money in my podcast technology, apart from telling me off for all the other things like this expensive microphone I just bought. Um, Nimesh, we've known each other for a very, very long time. You are now, I think, the fifth. Yeah, you're the fifth episode in David Anderson talking market data.
I
I'm not
am.
going to be launching until January, mid-January, but we're recording this, I think, on the 3rd of January is when this is. So as we chatted in the preamble, I know you very well. We're good friends. We've had lots of conversations in person, on the phone, etc. But could you briefly paint a picture of your illustrious, lengthy career? You told me your age earlier on. I won't say it on camera, but you can later on. I mean, I'm a venerable god. I'm going to be, what am I now? I'm losing track of age. I think I'm going to be I'm 66 and I'll be 67. I'm sort of at the tail end of my career. This is part of my semi-retirement. Nimesh, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, David, look, it's great to be here and great to be on this podcast. As always, you are far too kind to me uh, in your words and the way you express my
I'm a very
illustrious
kind
career.
person. Yeah.
Yes, I know, I know. For me, I've been around. I mean, let's be honest, I'm 50 years old now. I've definitely been around a
A
long time.
youngster. A youngster.
You say that, but it does age you, this industry at times. It definitely does age you, right? So many things happen, so fast moving. But I mean, I started my career, I would say, sort of mid late 90s. Worked for a vendor that doesn't really exist anymore. It's gone through a few iterations. I've had sell side experience, buy side experience, software house experience in my time, consulting. Um,
And
Across.
the sell side buy side is as a customer is buying. I mean that we were chatting earlier on because
I
you've
actually,
sold services and you bought services.
yeah, I've been on both sides for each side, so to speak, um, and I obviously I've done the OTC space as well. I've done the consulting space, and my experience is, you know, I would say geographically, I spent a lot of time in Europe. I covered the US as well, and more recently, I've been covering APAC for nearly the last 10 years, 10 plus years. So it's been an interesting journey, I can say the least. Uh, I'm fortunate, and I like to think of myself as fortunate that I've been given the opportunities to be able to do what I've been able to do. And
And
one,
we're fortunate that you've done those things. So Mutual Appreciation Society.
of course, of
I
course.
should stop being so sycophantic.
Yeah, no, come on. Look, I mean, in all the years, I think as you alluded to, you and I have known each other for years, and active part of a number of different initiatives. At one point, we worked for the same company as well, so uh, maybe
We,
just
we
slight overlap back
well
in the
look.
day.
Let's let's move. With these podcasts, and I was explaining to you before we came online. Um, I'm doing a first set of podcasts at a very high level. So this conversation you and I are going to have is going to be pretty high level. I plan, if people actually want to listen to these podcasts, watch them, to do some deeper dives in the future. So I think a lot of what we're doing now is sort of whetting the appetite, trying to get people interested in some of these topics, and then we can sort of dig deeper later on. I am aiming to do three topics with you, as I've done with my other guests.
Okay.
The first of those topics will be focusing on that geographic experience you've got, and especially focusing and asking you to share some of your insights about Asia Pacific. The second one, which is something I know you've been working on recently, and strangely, a lot of people are talking about it: artificial intelligence, AI, generative AI, etc. That's something. And then the last one, which I've actually talked about with quite a few people, and I'm going to do some more deep dives. I've written it down as data policies, all the issues to do with complexity and diversity of how data providers, exchanges, data vendors, etc., how they sort of set up their data policy. So we'll talk about that.
So you've
But
left the topic that everyone talks about and yet everyone hates till the end.
it'll be our finale. We can sort of go out strong.
Okay.
Yeah, I did wonder what order to ask these in, and I may even, I've said this on my other podcast, I may even edit this into three separate ones. I don't know.
Yeah.
It'll definitely be one long one, about an hour long. But if subsequently it makes sense to sort of edit these down into smaller chunks, we will do. And I really welcome, I'm sure you do, if this is on YouTube, I'm also going to do it via podcast channels like Spotify, sort of Apple Music, etc. But if it's on YouTube, you can add comments. So welcome comments from the audience, and also ask people to subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. But let's dive in. Let's So Asia Pacific. You live and work in Singapore, and I visited you several times there. I've had a lot of exposure both in my Reuters career, but subsequently in Asia Pacific. So market data, it's a global business, and I would posit that the two main centres are London and New York. London and New York are big, powerful, large-scale centres where a lot happens. But there's a lot more to life than just London and New York and Asia Pacific. Can you just set the scene? Try and sort of paint your picture of how you see it, and I think with a detailed focus on your thoughts on the market data industry in Asia Pacific.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point, sort of direction to sort of take it. Is when we look at it from a London and New York perspective, I would agree the market data space in London and New York is quite mature, and it has a focus on established systems and sort of legacy frameworks. Is the way I would kind of look at that side, or those two parts of the geographic regions. APAC, on the other hand, and this is something I've found over the years, APAC, on the other hand, is quite dynamic, but it's very fragmented. I think anyone who comes into this market and thinks of it as, we can, it's just like London, right? It's just like New York. We can just implement the same thing, and it will mean exactly the same thing across the whole of the region. Well, actually, no, you can't. And and I think even to this day, and I'm sure we'll come to this a little bit later in the conversation, but even to this day, we find organizations that sort of come into the market space that don't quite understand that dynamics. But before we kind of go there, think of it this way, David. If we look at each of the markets, and I'll kind of sort of at a high level kind of cover this for everyone, right? Whether it's Japan or whether it's Singapore or whether it's India, they all have their nuances, right? For instance, if we look at Japan, and I've been thinking about sort of what are the kind of the key areas, but Japan leans more towards sort of heavily on structured data environments, right? Whereas markets such as Indonesia as well are sort of leapfrogging straight forward through other styles of solutions. And Singapore itself has sort of positioned itself as the financial hub. Now that's an interesting thing for me to say. It's an interesting concept for me to say, because previously, I think you remember this, when people talked about Asia, they would talk about Japan, talk about Hong Kong, and then we'd look all the way down towards Australia as the core sort of established markets. And outside of sort of Japan and Australia, Hong Kong was kind of seen as that core financial hub. But obviously a lot of things have changed, and Singapore sort of positioned itself in this space. So I'd say definitely there are differences. If I look at it from an Asia perspective, what's going on within sort of cutting edge fintech solutions is probably one of the areas to look at. And whilst it seems like I'm detracting away from market data, all of this comes back to the way we consume data, what data is available,
I mean,
etc.
fintech is helping servicing in market data. Data is data, and fintech is applied to data. That's how I say it. So I think you're right. Fintech and technology in general is playing such a bigger, larger part in market data than it ever did 15 years ago, 20 years, 30, 40 years ago when I started in the industry. I mean, just giving my perspective as a non-APAC resident, who's somebody who's traveled in to the region a lot. I mean, like you, I sort of split it into developed markets and developing markets. And I think exactly to what you just said, it used to be you had, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia. I hope I'm not being too sort of British here, but that was the old Anglo influence. There was a lot of Anglo, ex-British Empire, and all that. The business culture, the nature. I think a lot has changed, but that initially was those three centres, and then Japan was very different. Japan was definitely not part of that sort of Anglo influence. And I remember, maybe it was even Reuters who I used to work for. I think they used to have Japan as one region and rest of Asia as another region. So they consciously separated Japan from the rest of Asia, which was
I think that still happens now. I still think that happens now. I think Japan is still very much its own market.
I mean, is that a language and a culture thing, or is it a different market beyond just the language and culture side of things? I mean, is it actually, I don't know, equities trading, but all the general stuff that goes on in all markets? I don't know how.
I mean, what is Japan like at the moment? Equities for sure, fixed income, absolutely. Has it been doing more within repo? Yes, that's true. But it has a particular way of doing business. So it is very cultural. But there has been over the last couple of years a slight shift. And I've done a tour of duty working for a Japanese organization, and even within those organizations, there is a set way of doing things and a set way of moving forward. And that sort of has implemented its way into, I'd say, the markets industry, and subsequently all of the key organizations that need to service that market have also had to adapt and say it has to be done in this particular way, right? Who do you need to speak to? What sign-offs do you need? I mean, I'm really simplifying here, David, but what sign-offs do you need to do? Which group does it need to go to? What's the next stage? But there has been one thing which used to happen quite a bit previously, was there was a slightly more longer-term view in Japan and the way it saw its partners and its providers. Okay. Japan has not been renowned for bringing in a organization or a service and then within 12 months pulling it out, or within 24 months pulling out the platform. That hasn't happened. If it's committed, especially if it's committed from Japan and Tokyo, it moves forward, and it will move forward to a point until it becomes a case of we really do need to do something different, which used to be every 10 years. That process of change is now sped up, and I think organizations in Japan are very much looking at what can they do right now to allow them to adapt more towards the way the markets are operating now. So rather than taking that longer term view, of course, and stabilize growth and stabilize revenue and don't rock the boat too much, fundamentally we've got to a stage where there is a change coming, and it's come from the much younger generation of Japanese that are now working within these organizations. So I think
so Japan still quite separate, but in itself changing.
Correct.
Then Australia. Well, Australia is its own thing. It's a long way away from everywhere. It's a wonderful country. I love it dearly, but it's a long way away from everywhere, and the time zone differences and what have you. And again, it's quite a sort of local market. I remember all the sort of the banks there had, to my knowledge, retrenched quite a lot. I remember in my early days in London, people like Westpac and ANZ and even Commonwealth Bank of Australia sort of had presences in London. I think they still do, but I get the sense they've gone much more back to their home base in Australia. They're not as global as maybe they used to be. I don't know if that's an accurate. And all my Australian friends, by all means, tell me I'm wrong. But that's just a sense when I've been to Sydney, that it's a little bit more of a regional slash local market.
I think it really depends on what sort of asset class you're talking about. If you're talking about the standard traditional derivatives markets that we previously, everyone's been in, whether it be fixed income or whether it be derivatives as a whole, then I would say yes, has some of that, or quite a lot of that's been scaled back from their global operations and brought back to Australia. But one of the largest trends that happened over the last couple of years has been with digital assets,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And the number of organisations, whether it be, and you've also got to think there's been a slight change within Australia, right? Everyone, I think, tends to or would think that Sydney's the place where everything happens, right? Where all the banks are. You've got the
yeah,
Macquaries and the Westpacs, etc., and the NABs. They're all there. But then you need to take a step outside and then say, well, what's going on with the buy side? And the buy
yeah,
side's based in Melbourne,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And it's
yeah.
based in Perth. And I
Okay.
don't think at some point we would have ever said, "Oh, Perth is where the buy side are." But yeah, I mean, they're having their Florida moment, I would say, where organisations are moving
And it
to the
is
buy side.
interesting that geographic split between the sell side and the buy side. I think, isn't it South Africa, Joburg sell side, Cape Town's buy side, the
Yeah.
US, Boston's the buy side, here in the UK is in Edinburgh. So yeah, it's interesting how you get. I don't know how rigid that is, but there's definitely a trend going on there. I mean,
But there,
let
def-
me.
there definitely seems to have been that sort of that shift, and I think Australia coming back as a global player is in a different way. Um, it's not the. I'm sure these fans would kind of look at me, but it's not the traditional guys that are going forward now. It's the new guys who've entered the digital era.
Okay. Well, I think we'll come back to that. By the way, I mean, I would say, as a final observation, that Macquarie obviously is the my sense is that's the more global player of the various Australian banks. But again, I'm sure there's a whole conversation argument to be had about that, and I'd love to learn more about it. I mean, switching coming north, a long way north, 7 hours north or whatever it is. Um, you've got Singapore and Hong Kong. Now, again, my vast oversimplification, calling those Anglo markets, Anglo influenced. Hong Kong was, but obviously Hong Kong isn't anymore. Hong Kong is very different. I don't want to get into politics or whatever, but the reality is, and I was in Hong Kong literally a short while ago, back in November, and I noticed it there just culturally. There's a lot more influence activity from mainland China. And I think you sitting in Singapore, how you mentioned that Hong Kong was, I don't know if that's the right tense, the sort of main APAC sort of hub. But I know a lot of institutions sort of moved that to Singapore. So Singapore was becoming more of the APAC hub. I mean, the Hong Kong Singapore play. How does that play out? Paint a picture on that. I'm putting you on the hot seat because it is. I don't know. Is it political or is it? I mean, there's a business side to it. But
Yeah,
ignoring why it happened, what's happening?
it's an interesting question. If we put all of those things aside, I think one of the key aspects that I've seen is around global acceptance. Um, and we look, politics aside, but we can't ignore it. obviously China's been going through a bit of a rough patch over
Yeah.
the last few years. And to a certain degree, that has, and its kind of push onto Hong Kong, has kind of slightly tarred Hong Kong with that same brush. Has that meant people are less likely to set up and be in Hong Kong? I don't know. I mean, if for some jurisdictions, it's made life a lot easier to set up various ventures, within Hong Kong. But I would say, from a regulatory standpoint, and I think that's one of the key aspects that we should factor in, that it's not about the data at this point, and it's not about the jurisdiction. It's about the regulatory sort of stance. I would say Singapore has done much more to have a more proactive regulatory methodology and stance towards firms coming in, but also a much more structured sort of framework for organizations to sort of move forward with. And you know, I think, you know, I'd say Singapore more recently has had more of a framework which is balanced towards innovation, but also investor protection. And I think that's been fundamentally key. I'm not saying Hong Kong doesn't have that, right? You've got the Securities and Futures Commission in Hong Kong as well. We're not saying that it doesn't have that in place, but with everything going on with the mainland, you know, the people are sort of looking at it and going, well, at which point potentially can all of this be overwritten?
I mean, I'm conscious I'm looking at the time as well, and we could. I mean, there's a mass to talk about. Let's talk a little bit longer on this, but
Yeah.
inevitably we're going to have to come back to this because we're just, scraping the surfaces. So we've got the whole, Japan quite separate and different. Australia doing its own thing. We got the Singapore, Hong Kong. Um, Again, I don't want to call it a battle. That's the wrong word, but there are definitely structural changes. I mean, my broad question to you, and we haven't even touched on India or Indonesia or the Philippines or Vietnam, Thailand, all these other countries. I mean, there's a whole sort of other part of the conversation about APAC, which we're probably not going to have time to talk about. But why we're talking about it, I would put it to you, and I'd ask you to answer this in this context. If you're a global entity, but a small global entity who's just starting out, and you've got your London office, you've got your New York office, those are probably the two markets you start off with. And then it's always the question, when do we do APAC? When do we tackle APAC? And I think, I wouldn't call it an afterthought, but it is, you go for the low hanging fruit first, which is probably, London and New York, and then you go to Asia Pacific, which is harder because it is, as you said, fragmented. It isn't, APAC trips off the tongue, but it isn't a singular thing, as we've already discussed. It's a multifaceted thing, which makes it difficult. So, I mean, what would your advice, simple, quick advice, be to firms about their APAC strategy if they don't have one yet?
Yeah. So I would say, look, if at a very, very high level, people need to, or organizations, if they truly want to sort of capitalize on APAC, one is to have it fairly early on in your cycle. Don't wait too long. You need to prioritize your region specific innovations. So, I mean, we are global, but as we've just said, it's fairly fragmented here. It's quite federated separately along the region. You've got to prioritize which ones or what solutions you want to sell into which areas. And if they're established markets, it's absolutely fine. But if it's Singapore, make sure your solution looks at Singapore. If it's Hong Kong, make sure it looks at Hong Kong. Japan, absolutely. And I would say one of the largest things here is, if you're provide some level of software or indication, make sure it has as many multiple language interfaces as possible. And the other thing would be have a sort of flexible subscription for emerging economies, right? Just because we pay $1,000 here for a solution in Singapore doesn't mean a smaller shop within one of the emerging economies within the region will be looking to pay exactly the same. I'd also
And
say,
layers to that I mean, one thing we haven't talked about is India, which
yes,
is going gangbusters. But I mean, India arguably isn't as developed as Australia, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. But I would say it's much more developed maybe than Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. Again, I'm oversimplifying massively.
but the reason it's done that, obviously, from a political standpoint, India has had a change over the last few years. There's
Yeah.
been more push on regulation. There's been more focus both on the consumer side of banking as well as sort of other aspects. Obviously, there's investment going into things like Gift City. But if I was to simplify it down, I'd say India's openness and it's the way it's embraced scalable digital infrastructure, right? That's the one thing that has kind of taken sort of put the rocket ship up into the right direction, is the fact that it's embracing this scalable infrastructure to meet the growing demands, but not just the growing demands of what's going on within India itself, but within a few 100,000 miles of the coast.
I mean, we're again scraping the surface, but we have to move on. So I think I'm going to take your advice offline. How to tackle. Maybe we have a podcast on Singapore, a podcast on Hong Kong. I don't know. How we can be helpful in providing insight on your region.
Well, let me before we move on
Yeah.
to sort of the next part. Let me sort of uh, sort of say one last thing. If we're
Yeah.
looking at suppliers or market data vendors coming into, and I've said what they need to do, but if I completely simplify it, I would say anyone who is a data vendor, irrespective, or a supplier, need to enhance their value prop and stay ahead of the rapidly evolving landscape, because Asia is actually rapidly evolving even in those emerging spaces, right? Even in the emerging countries. So you kind of need to stay ahead. And if you were looking at sort of investment in your product, start pushing it there, because there are more Asian firms coming to the forefront than there are big European and big US firms coming into the Asia market.
So you genuinely, you're sitting there in is it? I mean, it was a lot more growth. I remember 10 years ago when you looked at Europe and North America, APAC was growing much faster. I haven't really studied that or looked at that more recently. Is your sense sitting there that APAC is growing faster than the established markets of North America and Europe?
I think so, very much so.
That's a good opportunity, but it's complicated. So I think we need to come back to it. So I'll hopefully have you on a future edition. Maybe you could help me find some other voices as well, to guide people, because I think all I'm trying to do here is provide some education and advice to people who might be looking at the region. So excellent. By the way, you can probably hear dogs in the background. That's my Ring doorbell. I should have unplugged it here. The joys of live podcasting, or not
Yes.
live, but anyway. All right, so that was a little taster on Asia Pacific as a region, which we'll come back to. Move on to a very small subject, which 5 minutes will probably do. AI is cool. Generative AI is the new thing. Done. Isn't that all we need to talk about? So
Absolutely. AI will do everything and it will fix everything for you. So honestly, David, we don't need to discuss it.
it's crazy. I mean, it's the real hot topic of the moment, especially generative AI. And I know you want to talk beyond that. But again, I would ask you to offer your thoughts on AI in respect of the market data industry. And can I can I sort of compartmentalize that in two different ways? And again, you can tell me if that compartmentalizing doesn't make sense, but it's how I think about it in my own head. One question is how could consumers of the market data, people in the business, in a bank or a buy-side institution who are trading or investing or whatever they're doing, how might they use AI, generative AI, with the data, the market data that they're being sold? What are the sort of things going on there, problems and opportunities? And then the market data industry is all those companies with data to sell or technology to sell. I mean, how should those companies, they, and I use the word vendor in its pure English sense, so, all these firms who have either product or services to sell. So I think they're different discussions in my head.
They are and they're not, I would say. If we look at AI, the very first step we kind of take is, where can AI help? And actually, it's where it can transform data processing, whether it's, and again, I stopped using the words market data because data is everything. Organizations now run on a huge amount of data. And if this was a few years ago, I would have said, well, that's all market data because it's used for decision making and it's based on this and it's based on that. But fundamentally, it's all data. So where can AI help, right? So transforming data processing, making it faster, making it more accurate, I think, David, and insightful. What can it do? What else can it do? What else can it generate?
When you say data processing, are you including data analysis? I mean, because I would thought it's more looking at lots of data and trying to infer meaning and sense from it is where I think.
I mean, yes. Are there organizations out here that are currently looking and building out AI-based platforms that are more based on predictive models for market behavior? Absolutely. But I think the real sort of game changer that's sort of coming along is generative AI.
Yeah.
Where it learns and adapts autonomously to changing data patterns.
Okay.
Right? Now, the question there is, do we then call that deductive AI? Right?
And you use that phrase, so I'm sort of nodding, but I'm not quite understanding you. So educate me. Deductive? I mean, I sort of know what the word means, deducing something, inferring something. Explain more.
Absolutely. So at the moment, we have models now, and we have AI models that effectively work as our assistants or our co-pilots, or everyone, whether it be Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they all provide those models. We have assistants that help us in the form of ChatGPT, and every single module that sits underneath there. You ask it a question, it gives you an answer. You ask it to frame something in a particular way, it gives you something back. It's learning, it's evolving in terms of the inputs that it's receiving, and refining the answer. Now, what happens next? Well, a deductive AI model would start to look at you and I asking it, or a simple question, or it analyzing a set of information that's being pushed through its model and being displayed on a screen or a system, and suddenly it's beginning to give you more and more insights and saying, actually, whilst this information says the market's going to go in this particular direction, I've deduced by analyzing all the information and the way I've learned all of this, that actually the market's going to go in the opposite direction. And I'm really simplifying there. Yeah. So why don't we'll re-look at the allocations within this portfolio or the way we're trading, and then it automatically goes and implements that. Now the question there is, are we still talking about the human going, well, it's given me all the insights, do I press the button and say, yes, do that, because it makes sense? Or do I allow it to just go ahead
Well, I mean,
make a decision.
that last little phrase you said, shall we just do it if it makes sense? The if it makes sense, I would say that's what we're talking about, explainability. Because one that, you're asking AI can deduce, can infer, can tell you all sorts of wonderful new insights that you weren't aware of. But do you trust it? Because we know two of the major problems with generative AI, one is hallucinations, and another one is bias. The hallucination one is it just dreams up. It just tries to be helpful. I don't think it's malicious. It being generative AI just comes up. Well, this is a pretty good answer from all the things I know. I don't know everything. This is a good answer, so I'll offer it up.
But
But
again,
it might be the wrong answer.
no, that's true. But that's why the AI models now and the platforms that you use now have a number of gates within the system, to help focus it.
Guardrails, yeah,
No guardrails, as you said. So, to help focus what it should and it shouldn't be doing. And yes, if you open them up, you get hallucinations. But actually, I would say the models are getting better and better. When the models are built specifically for a particular reason or a particular operation or a function, and the inputs that it's learning from is only coming from those specific key areas, we're not allowing it to go too far out, then actually the answers it comes back with are fairly spot on, right? I would say I've seen a lot of development within the AI space over the last 18 months.
I mean, you can't tell us secret source. You can't tell us anything confidential, I think. But I mean, give us some practical examples that are not secret, that are generalized or whatever. I mean, what have you seen recently?
What I have seen is organizations utilizing AI to streamline its KYC process, for instance, right?
Know your client.
Know your client. So it's reducing its manual intervention by around about, and what I've seen, they've managed to reduce that manual intervention by about 70%. Right, which is quite an operation.
Yeah,
which is process, right?
I mean, what? I mean,
But
again,
another one.
how did it do that? I mean, very basically, not secret. I'm sort of putting it on the spot, which I don't want to do, but I'm just trying to not just take your word, but sort of.
So the way the organisations have done this, and what I'll add to this, because my explanation I give you in a moment sort of covers what everyone is sort of doing, right?
Yeah.
We've got another organisation that's looked to analyse alternative data for commodity price predictions. Okay, we've looked at, as we said, increasing adoption of AI within sort of the efficiency in the compliance space and optimizing sort of payment processing, fraud detection, safer environment for financial ecosystems. Okay, and I've actually seen some AI-based wealth management platforms sort of come into the foray as well, especially around sort of personal investment and sort of automated regulatory reporting and compliance costs, reducing sort of compliance costs. Now, how have they done all of that? The very first thing they've done, and to be able to sort of help reduce this down, is we've taken a couple of steps back and we've looked at the organization and the processes. Now, we could say, back in the days we'd call it business process re-engineering, business process transformation. I would say today it's sort of AI intelligence framework is the way I would look at it. People are looking at what they currently have, what operations they have, and saying, how do we implement an AI intelligence framework into this, which then gives us operational efficiencies across a number of different areas. And it's not a quick and easy process, unfortunately, David. You've got to look at what's going on at the moment. You've got to look at all of the touch points, and you have to look at how do you re-engineer that, right? And there's lots of technology out here, and solutions from a lot of providers that can help you streamline those processes and move forward a little bit faster. But I think the way people have looked at it is, I mean, on the KYC side of things, it was very much a case of looking at their processes, looking at their ticketing systems, looking at various aspects and saying, my God, why are we spending so much time answering this question, going back with this one, looking at this bit, what's going on here, etc. Every one of those is a manual step and step and step.
I mean, I'm going to pounce on that in a slightly controversial way. Does that make certain jobs redundant? Does that mean there are less jobs for our kids and the next generation coming through because AI is going to replace all those manual processes?
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I think humanity has to evolve, right? We can't say, when we say, is it going to replace jobs for our children? No, I don't think it is. I just think our children will have adapted to the new world. It's the likes of you and I that it takes a little bit longer to adapt to the new world. But all things considered, we've seen a lot of change during our time. Our children, however, have been almost brought up in this new environment.
Yeah.
Right? So the jobs they'll be looking at will be very different. And they're doing a lot of what's required moving forward today. Right?
Got it. So what do you see? I mean, on the AI front, what's coming next? And trying to sort of talk generally, but if you can, us in the market data world, what's coming next? What should we be watching out for? Well, maybe people like you and I, but definitely people more midway through their career, what should they be educating themselves, training themselves on? What advice would you give?
I definitely think there's an opportunity for what we call a prompt engineer at this stage. All right? The better you are at creating prompts, I think there's definitely, how do you interrogate that AI model to get the answers that we need, right? I think the ability and jobs out there from a programmatic perspective of being able to build LLM models, large language models, or enhance them to do particular functions. I think that's something we should sort of look at. But I also think that there is a huge need, and we're seeing it happen already, where there is an increase in looking at existing regulatory frameworks and seeing how AI sort of fits into that, right? And what needs to happen to sort of mitigate this new technology and the potential risks, especially within the financial markets, right? So I think regulators are now sort of coming in and sort of playing a part there. What does it mean in terms of jobs? Well, you've kind of got to adapt and factor that in and understand that, I would say, that regulatory environment around the use of AI.
And that let's briefly flip back to the Asia Pacific conversation, because I think one of the things I've sensed is that the EU is looking or has looked to do some AI regulatory. There's more of an AI focus in the EU. I'm less clear about the US, especially if there's changes of government coming up. But what about Asia Pacific? I mean, is it the Monetary Authority of Singapore? I mean, does it sit in something like MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or is it higher up than that in the regulatory framework?
No, I think it does, and all of the regulators have their own now specific groups aimed at tackling this. If we look at things like India, for instance, it's got its Aadhaar-linked identity verification system. And that highlights the need for AI models to be tailored to meet specific regulatory frameworks, right? Japan's got very strict data privacy laws, right? And then if we look at things like, again, Reserve Bank of India has guidelines. I'm focusing because you told me I didn't speak about India earlier, so I'm giving you a little bit of India. I'm giving
Get a
you a
bit of
little bit of
India in
India
there.
here now.
Yeah, get some India in there.
It's issued guidelines on responsible use of AI in financial services. So, and there's a huge ethical standards part that's coming in as well. And all of the regulators are looking at whether it's Japan, whether it's India, whether it's Singapore. All of them are looking at it. All of them are actively looking at how do they sort of tackle this new space. And each one has had a steering group set up with a number of banks, small, medium, and large organizations, as well as software houses, to start addressing what needs to be done for the financial markets, and looked at a phase 1 impact, a phase 2 impact, and a phase 3 impact.
But just you saying that is an interesting flashback to the Asia Pacific conversation. It isn't one regulator. There's an Indian regulator. There's MAS in Singapore. There's Hong Kong Monetary Authority, I think. It's multiple regulatory frameworks who aren't. Do they coordinate? Do they communicate? I mean, how?
Actually, I mean, much to, I, I would definitely say, much to even my surprise in the early days, the regulators in a lot of the Asian jurisdictions do actually discuss some of the aspects that are going on. I mean, the last time they sort of sat down and got together to discuss stuff pre-AI was when LIBOR was sort of going in a particular direction, right? So they do discuss, they do look at what's happening in which space, and they all look to implement the best of breed. So I would say, is India implementing all of what Singapore's done within the AI regulatory space? I don't know. I don't think it is. But then again, vice versa, it isn't going the other way around. But what they are doing is saying, well, actually, David, you know what? We like that bit. We like that bit. That makes sense for us, and we like that bit. And we like that bit.
Is that almost regulatory arbitrage? Does that go on?
I think so.
Gaming the system, trying to find the.
Well, I wouldn't say gaming, but I mean, none of them can put something in place where it becomes inherently impossible to continue to do business, right? And whether we look at it from a people perspective, or we look at it from a systematic perspective or an AI perspective, everyone still has to do business with everyone. And in today's world, it's much smaller than it was many, many moons ago, because everyone has access to digital infrastructure and communication. So you've got to do business, right?
I know. It is a very, very small world. We touched the surface of AI. We're going to come back to that on future podcasts. David Anderson talking market data, hopefully talking with Nimesh Bharadia again on AI. So let's shift to the final, another easy topic, quick one. The data policies discussion. It's a bit drier, maybe. It's gosh, we've been talking about it for 20, 30 years, and we haven't solved it. That in itself says something. I mean, again, I characterize the problem, the issue, as being that you go to a particular data provider, it could be an exchange, and you find that their policies are highly complicated, whether you agree with them or disagree with them. And I'm putting the agree and disagree bit to one side. I'm just saying, to understand them in order to be able to comply with them, you look at a policy and it's often very difficult. That is then exacerbated by the fact there's 200-300 other exchanges who all do it a bit differently. I mean, that's my simplistic summing up of the problem.
Well, how long, David, have we been having the discussion? And I say we, and I use we because it's been happening across the board, around why can't all of these exchanges and vendors have the same policy for this particular use case, for this case, etc., 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 right? And no one's ever come to the table and said, you know what, David, we agree with the way you've written this understanding. We're going to adopt that as our policy. Because there's obviously a commercial monetary impact, right? And a business impact as well,
Yep.
attached to making certain policies too stringent or certain policies too lax. Um, but
There's
I
also,
mean, it's,
and I don't know if you can comment on this. There's the established legacy providers position, which is slightly different to the upstart disruptor position, which I think one of the firms you work for were more in the disruptor side than the established side. I'm not mentioning any names here, but that's an interesting one because if you've got massive market dominance and you don't want to change, but if you're new and upstarty, you can offer up all the new weird and wacky new ideas.
yeah, you can, and one of the ones which I chuckle at whenever I hear it is when a new upstart says, "Oh yes, of course you can have access to our data for nothing for free, and you can use it however you want to use it."
But they always start. I mean, that's a good
And they all
start.
start that way. That's it.
Free heroin.
So so maybe the way to look at it is: are the new upstarts doing something different to the existing players out there? And I would say, at the very beginning, even those existing players did exactly the same thing, right? We just look at it differently now because I'd say, I don't know, David, last 5 years, 4 years for sure, there's been a huge increase in newer data providers out there because there's been a requirement by the market as a whole to look for alternative sources.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about alternative data. That's a discussion point and a topic
Yeah.
that's gone away quite a number of years ago. But alternative sources of information. People want more information to be able to make more accurate decision making and to be able to sort of give themselves a better short, medium, and long term view in terms of the way they're operating as a whole. So newer, more niche players have come into the market. For that, people have started to provide certain information in ways which don't have the policy framework around it at this stage. They've not looked at it. I don't think I've come across someone new, and when I've said, "What's your data policy?" they've said, "Oh, here you go, Nimesh. You can find it on our website here." The answer is it isn't. People don't think about the data policy. People just want their data ingested.
And I think it's only once that data starts to be consumed and people start paying for it that then the data oh well, we could get a bit more money if we did it this way, if we charged a bit extra for how you use it or where you use it.
But I think the one thing people are missing within the sort of this space is data ownership, and especially cross-border sharing of data or data sharing.
Yeah.
Right? These are
Expand on that.
these are kind of constant, kind of constant pain points, especially now, right? If you look at APAC's regulatory landscape, it varies significantly, right? And there are stricter policies in China compared to sort of more open frameworks in Singapore. But let's simplify it right down. If you look at data within Indonesia, what is the one golden rule that's out there? Well, if you do a trade and you generate some pricing, that information and that data has to stay onshore, right? You can only push it into a secondary environment or a tertiary environment as a backup.
So if somebody wants to invest in the Indonesian stock market from London, are they not allowed? Again, I don't know much about the Indonesian market.
But it's it's definitely about the way the pricing is quoted and which database or repository it hits first. Right? So I'm not saying that it's impossible to do, and people do it, but it's the way you have to architecture your infrastructure and your solution to accommodate the regulatory landscape to say, I've quoted this particular price, but it needs to be stored, within the Indonesian framework first before it goes anywhere else. And people do smart things.
And just that simple example, I mean, whether you agree or disagree isn't the issue. It's just trying to understand all these permutations, all these little quirks, and to build a system, a process. If you're on the consuming side, if you're a bank or a buy-side institution, and you're taking on board all these different data providers, different exchanges, different interdealer brokers, different whoever, it is a complex situation. Let me throw another thought. Sorry.
But look at it this way. Why don't we add one other layer of complexity to it, which people don't necessarily factor in, and that's the difference between offshore pricing and onshore pricing. What's traded locally versus what's traded.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
that also has an impact on the way on which data can go this way and which
I
data has to stay here first.
I must admit, I hadn't really thought about that one. So that's another permutation that. Thank you. You've educated me on that. But let me throw a thought at you, or a question at you. A way I've looked at this is, and somebody told me off saying this was a horrible way of looking at things, but it's the best analogy I could come up with. The problem we're describing is a disease. It's a disease, and ideally we want to find the cure to that disease. That would be, getting everybody to do the same policies or whatever would be some sort of cure. But in reality, it's impossible or so difficult to get a cure. We've tried and we've failed as an industry. But there have been a lot of organizations popping up, quite a few more recently, some that I know you're aware of, who I would say are addressing the symptoms. Again, I'm using a British example. We have a product called Night Nurse, which is a bottle. If you get a horrible stinking cold or flu, you take a slug of Night Nurse and your nose, doesn't run anymore. Your headache goes away. It hasn't cured the cold,
No.
but it's just made you feel a lot better and taken the nasty symptoms away. So I think there are a number of organizations out there selling solutions to the symptoms, relieving the symptoms. They don't cure the disease. Are you following my analogy?
No.
It's a horrible. I've got to
am.
find a better
I am.
analogy than that.
No, I agree. I am. And just for the record, anyone coming to Singapore, you cannot buy Night Nurse here. But yeah, I do agree. But I think the reason why people aren't focusing on the complete cure and only dealing with the symptoms is because the organizations they're dealing with have such a high degree of legacy platforms and environment that actually you can't create the cure. You have to relieve the symptoms at the outward layer and keep sort of moving in bit by bit by bit by bit. It's a bit like, maybe the analogy is you're trying to grow a flower. And every now and then, to get it to promote growth, you've got to snip a branch here and snip a little bit here and snip here and keep watering so that in the end it flourishes and becomes
Pruning.
There you go. It becomes the rose that you wanted at the end, right?
I saw what you did there. Rose Executive, what a fine company name.
But again, if you look at it that way, then I think it's probably the simplest way I could kind of describe it.
I mean, what
until we're so the overall cure. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I honestly, David, I don't mean I don't know. I mean, if we look at it again,
your head is hurting as mine.
That is part of the. I definitely say that's part of the reason as to why people only look at sort of dealing with the symptoms and not trying to tackle the cure, because organizations cannot adapt fast enough to implement the cure, and it will have far-reaching ramifications on what they do have as an operation. So I think that's part of the reason they look at it and say, if we can just deal with this symptom here, then next time we'll deal with the next bit of the symptom and the next bit of the symptom.
And even if you deal with one of the 5 symptoms, you feel a bit better. You know, it's like you aren't 100% better, but if your nose stops running, you still got the headache. So it's a horrible analogy, but
Yes, yes.
but it's the way I've sort of got wrapped my head around it. Um, so look, again, that's a topic I'm going to come back to more and more. So I may tap into your expertise on that. I think it's interesting what you mentioned. I mean, there are some Asia Pacific specifics, Pacific and specifics. You have to really get your tongue around that one.
Yeah.
So I think that's something worth having a future conversation on. We're sort of drawing slowly to a conclusion. I think what I'd ask you to share with the world, any high level, concluding remarks about the market data industry as you see it, as we are at the very beginning of 2025, in your 50th year and in my 66th year. What are we seeing? What are we going to see? Some sort of wrap up thoughts. It's a
Right.
big question. Yeah.
It's a big question. Where do you start? Where do you start? But okay, let's look at it this way. Let's look at some of the things that we've seen, and we've addressed these already. We know there's been a massive increase and demand for financial organizations leveraging AI for a number of processes. Is that going to impact the market data industry? Absolutely yes. Right. From data analysis, enhancement, through to process, through to trading, through to portfolio management, through to compliance. And I'm seeing all of that, and Rose is seeing all of that as part of it as it moves.
And Rose is your consultant. We didn't talk.
Oh,
Rose is your
Rose is my
consulting gig.
consulting firm,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And we're seeing that. But added to that, the stringent regulatory requirements that are sort of coming through and people are sort of beginning to implement across their organizations will have inherent impact on the market data industry. Because I think as we look at the huge potential of what's AI doing in terms of being able to transform financial operations, with that will come further regulation and governance on cleaner data. Sort of, what's the old adage? The AI model is, if it's garbage in, it gives you garbage out, which is what we used to say about ESG as well, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. But from a global perspective, I think the US is going to sort of, for market data, there'll be more focus within sort of predictive analysis or analytics. So if you see, if you start getting requests come through for more and more data, so it'll be based because they've got more systems that they're trying to move forward with. I think improved data ethics. So I think market data compliance is going to become a bigger issue, and also misuse of data is going to become an issue. So suppliers providing data in, you'll start seeing a bigger focus, especially with sort of LLMs and AI tools.
Sort of intellectual property.
Well, I wouldn't just say intellectual property, but just how are you using it? What systems
Yeah.
are processing it? Remember, you have an AI model, and the AI model talks to 15 different platforms, which it didn't do before. And David, I'm overly simplifying. That has an impact, right? I'd say, GDPR is going to continue to affect what's going on. DORA will continue to impact.
Yeah.
And if we just touch on that, remember, we talk about operational resilience, and it was put in place mainly to deal with the technology stack of an organization. But actually, I'm seeing firms implement models of DORA across all of its stack, from procurement cycles to
MAS, the monetary authority. It is the monetary authority of Singapore, MAS, isn't it? Didn't they have resiliency rules way before DORA?
Yes.
I'm sure somebody told me that 99% uptime rules or something for banks and stuff.
No. They have done, but I mean it's becoming more and more stringent. And then you've got APRA as well within Australia, that has operational resilience rules underneath there as well. So organisations, especially global organisations, are going to have more of a are looking at what are going to be the impact points outside of just the technology stack. you've then got, well, can you, and again, we've talked about this, can you look at data coming from a single supplier, but it's coming from sort of two resilient lines? Well, now people are saying, well, maybe that's not necessarily the case. You've got to spread that out. So I think for 2025, if you are dealing with market data, to a certain degree, I think you're going to have your hands full for this year coming up. I think regulation is becoming a massive part of your day-to-day job, and understanding that and how it impacts your business is going to be fundamentally key in terms of how you would manage market data or data services within your organization. Contractually, compliance, usage rights, and then if your organization is moving forward with AI solutions, then I think you need to put your learning cap on and start understanding some of these technologies and trying to maybe have a proactive conversation with your suppliers in terms of which policies best fit your organization.
And I think the words you're searching for is that all people out there should diligently watch all the future episodes of David Anderson talking market data. That was at the tip of your tongue.
Absolutely. I was going to get to that, David. But I'd say, look, everyone needs to stay curious, stay adaptive, and don't underestimate the power of collaboration. I would probably say now more than ever with firms, markets are evolving extremely quickly, and embracing and adopting change is your best strategy.
Nimesh, thank you. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I want to invite you back. I think we'll talk offline, but I'm sure there's going to be some deeper dives that we can do into some of these topics. I look forward to seeing you in May at the FISD Asia Pacific event that both of you and I will be at. So looking forward to coming back. I love Singapore. Looking forward to coming back. Won't be earning my British Airways tier points anymore. That's another podcast. British Airways have changed their whole policy. So.
I saw an email about that.
Oh, horrible.
Don't tell me. Don't tell me. You'll ruin the surprise.
Yeah. Anyway, look, thank you. Don't hang up because I told you about the technology, but I'm going to stop the recording now. So bye-bye to the audience.
Okay. Bye-bye, guys. Thank you, David.